Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today, we're rejoined by political theorist, writer, rock and roll terrorist, heartbreaker, Thomas777. Thomas, how is life off Twitter? Because Thomas was recently banned from Twitter.
No, things have been actually pretty, in some ways, I think it was a blessing in disguise, man, because it kind of, we get kind of complacent when we have a platform that has broad reach, just kind of in and of itself. It kind of forced me to get active on Gab and Post and some of these lesser known platform structures that truly are, free speech oriented. And plus Telegram, my Telegram's really blown up, and these particularly Telegram, but also Gab and Post, really allow me to be the master of my own content. And it's kind of and if you build it, they will come scenario. People have really responded well. So things have been quite good, honestly. That's not just me trying to see the glasses half full. But no, thanks for asking. Things have been dope.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we missed you on Twitter. Maybe you can sneak back. I know you tried to sneak back on briefly after, but it didn't quite work out. But you'll have to use a different name. Maybe Timothy 666 or something. Maybe you could do that. We'll look into it. But today we're talking not necessarily something about current events, but about history. We're going to discuss the Cold War and George Kennan. George Kennan was one of the most famous diplomats of the 20th century. He wrote this famous long telegram in 1947 that demanded that we pursue a strategy of containment against the Soviet Union. And at early 47, we were still not sure what to do with the Soviet Union. There were still people who were wanting us to be allies with the Soviet Union, and Kennan forced us to see the Soviet Union as our primary enemy in the world. And he's loved by paleoconservatives for his foreign policy realism, and he's really probably one of them. If you're taking like a foreign policy class in college, probably going to read a lot about George Kennan. But Thomas, you're a big fan of Kennan, so can you give us some more details about this Russian expert?
Well, what's interesting about Kennan is the following. Like, Kennan had, in some ways, he really had a deep understanding of the Russian people. And that's one of the reasons why he became an authority, not just on the culture and kind of the first Sovietologist, but it also owes to his State Department posting in the Soviet Union. But the regime in Moscow turned against him, owing to the fact that Kennan, despite his brilliance kind of in private quarters and in his academic work and in his kind of analytical musings, for all of his ability in that regard, when he made public statements, he kind of almost unfailingly put his foot in his mouth. And he compared Stalin's regime in the most punitive way possible to the Third Reich at Moscow airport, like in terms of their purported unwillingness to tolerate, kind of free discussion on policy issues, which at that time, involved...
And he did this while ambassador to Russia. So.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it kind of begs the question as to how could he possibly be so foolish? But aside from that little foible, he basically what's really most interesting about Kennan is that Kennan was, he was the consummate diplomat. Like, how in the old days in the military, like when somebody was awarded a valor decoration, there's very specific language that was invoked, and usually would say that the man in question had a, quote, bias for action. Well, diplomats in some ways have a bias for inaction, or they have a bias for action other than direct confrontation, and Kennan was like very much in that mold, which is fascinating because, as you know, Kennan's notion of containment, it really involved generating interdependence with the non-aligned world and kind of courting states like Romania and like Yugoslavia that were not natural allies of, the Russians, kind of away from the burgeoning Warsaw Pact security structure. Yet people, when they think of containment, they think of basically, rollback and kind of the post-Eisenhower, very confrontational notion of how to deal with communism. So, I think overall, Kennan really was a light amidst the darkness. On the other hand, I think his blind spots were he was constantly invoking traditional sphere of influence paradigms in terms of what we should tolerate from the Soviets, like how we should assert our own security interests. And don't get me wrong, I'm very much a realist and a traditionalist in terms of power political questions. However, I don't think Kennan had a really full grasp of the nuclear question and kind of the strategic nuances therein. But he was an incredibly ballsy guy. One of the reasons why the left came to hate him is because he visited South Africa a lot, and that was during the Boer apartheid regime. And Kennan was a pretty decent guy. He's like, look, he's like, I don't like hearing about blacks being subjected to petty indignities, but he's like, at the same time, he's like, the whites in South Africa, they are the masters of the culture. It is their culture. It's the reason why South Africa is a first world country. If they want to maintain an apartheid regime, that's really none of anybody's business. In fact, he's like, this is in fact, a beacon of progress on the dark continent. And obviously that didn't really win him a lot of friends. But he was somewhat rehabilitated by people who wouldn't ordinarily be sympathetic to right-wing views, because he was a staunch opponent to the Vietnam War, and which is interesting to me because, I mean, the way the Vietnam War was waged was a disaster. But again, Kennan's notion was, look, like, really the only areas of influence that really should matter to America are the Soviet Union, Western and Central Europe, Japan and Korea, and of course, the North and South American continents. That's kind of naive, frankly, in Cold War, in terms of the challenges presented by the Cold War. I mean, the issue in Vietnam was always that it doesn't really matter that Vietnam itself is worthless in terms of its resources or its geostrategic value. Like, the fact is, like, this is the line that was drawn in the sand between the West and communism, and the litmus test is, will the West fight? Will it deploy and force militarily to stop a communist takeover of a state it's staked as an ally? I mean, that's a question too. That's a bit of a tangent. But yeah, I mean, I guess my point is that Kennan was a very dynamic figure, very much a man of the right, but very much a nuanced man of the right, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, he, I have 2 points. Both of us read the same biography of Kennan recently by John Lewis Gaddis, who is I guess you would describe him as a neoconservative, because George W. Bush really liked him and he advised the Bush administration, even though I think he's like a Harvard or Yale historian. He still was communicating with the Bush administration and helped shape a lot of their policy, but he does give a fair treatment to Kennan, and Kennan gave him all access. He had plenty of interviews with Kennan and his wife and his family members throughout the book. And there's two notions from the book that I want to discuss. One is, like, very briefly, is like Kennan kept a diary, and this is kind of revealing of him as a person, not necessarily him as a theorist or his politics, but when he kept a diary, all he kept talking about is how much he hates his life and how everything sucks. It's like total black pill doer posting. Like, if you see people on Twitter who are just like, everything sucks, I can't get a girlfriend, we're all gonna die. Like, this is him in his diary, and he would just do it like compulsively. He'd be like, have this successful life. He's meeting all these world leaders. Everyone is loving his book. Like, he's getting all these prizes. He's got an easy job that allows him to do what he wants. And he's just like sitting there scribbling in his diary about how much he hates his life and he should kill himself. and like the Gaddis, like all the people who Gaddis talked to in the book, like his wife and stuff, feel like, well, he wasn't really like that outside of his diary. But it is one thing, like, he kept the diary in order to, like, show history who he is. And he kept this, like, morose, like, whiny guy who's like, I'm sailing along Norway and I'm really feeling down today and life is over. It's like, we're all going to be nuked in 5 years. And this is, like, how he, like, interacted with life. I guess that's, like, one way of coping with struggles, is you just keep a personal diary. But he kept the diary in order for, like, somebody, a historian, to go through it and then get a assumption of his life. And, it's like a not very pretty picture. I guess it shows him very human. I mean, he does, like, struggle with many things throughout life, like him being like 70 years old and checking out some like hot young woman and be like, I can't have that anymore. It's like, that's depressing. But that is an interesting part of his personality, is that he did have this, but even though it didn't translate fully into his public persona, he did have this type of personality that's very similar to a lot of paleoconservatives. Like, everything is over, everything is done. Like, our only hope is to, like, retreat into the forest and maybe they'll forget about us. And a lot of times his public pronouncements were like that. We'll get to that in a moment. But the other thing is that he wrote an article. Well, I think he intended it to have it published, but it was never published for some reason. And he wrote this in the 30s when he was just he was a service officer in the Russian embassy. And he outlined a whole political structure for America. And in this political structure, it would deny citizenship to blacks, immigrants, and I believe women. And it would just be run as a state. And they discovered, and you were talking about him being politically incorrect. And this wasn't somebody who was like a far right wing firebreather. Like he hated McCarthy. He hated, he hated the South. He he thought that the civilized America should break off and form a country with Canada and leave the South and Texas and California on its own. And that was his plan. Like he wasn't necessarily friendly to any segregationists or, the people that traditionally made up the American right. But he had this idea that, I think like some people on Twitter, maybe even like some white nationalists would find a little extreme. And he wrote this, and I think in the 70s he tried to deny that it was like anything important, but it was like an article he wanted submitted. So how do you reconcile these two conceptions of this person who is like deeply elitist, held very reactionary views, especially for an American, but a lot of his pronouncements seem very similar to a lot of the people who work in the deep state today. I mean, you could relate to what a lot of he's saying and the contempt he has for ordinary middle Americans. So how do you reconcile? What's the connection between those conflicting views?
I mean, I think really in Kennan's case, Kennan was a big Calvinist, and that's one of the reasons why he had a sympathetic view of the South Africans, while to your point, having contempt for the South. I mean, so I think Kennan had this idea that, he was kind of an old school sort of like theocrat almost, and he used to make the point that like, like secularism cannot carry America. Like it doesn't matter how technologically advanced it is. It doesn't matter how much it leads the world in commerce and science and things. So I think there's that. And I think that, he very much had a white man's burden sensibility of a kind that was very scriptural based, not of a kind of, swaggering sort of racialist type. But I believe in a State Department that has endured very much. Like I think the State Department really post Baker from about 93 onward, I think it's been a disaster. It truly is like an iteration of clown world, as the colloquialism online brands it, the deep state, I mean. But the difference is Kennan's notion, his elitism was tempered, and him being the kind of consummate Machiavellian that he was constantly making the point that this is terrible, that this kind of moral cant is like introduced into foreign policy questions, and he's like, when the Soviets hear this, it's dangerous because they take it seriously and they really do believe, Washington's on some crusade against them. They don't realize that in America, you've got to kind of placate public opinion. And I mean, in the old State Department, guys did truly understand, like, look, like this is the narrative we sell and why we're in Vietnam, or, why we're in Nicaragua arming the Contras, but nobody actually believes it. Like the difference is that these days, like the State Department, they really do believe their own bullshit. Like they're high in their own supply. So they've retained that kind of elitist sort of sense of themselves as the elect, to kind of, light the world forcefully if need be. But they kind of have come to disdain or just have no ability to comprehend the sort of realist overlay that should govern their perception of the planet. I mean, I think that's kind of the tie that binds people like Kennan with kind of the current crop of foreign service officers and hacks who find themselves in coveted positions in Department of State. I mean, I believe that's what it is. I mean, Kennan was interesting. He went as far as much as he distanced himself from some of that earlier copy about his utopian America, where nobody would have citizenship other than enlightened Christian white men. Like the one piece that he did retain really until the Vietnam era was he said people who agitate blacks towards radicalism and these campus type extremists who are agitating against the Vietnam War. He said we need to organize political courts in order to try these people and incarcerate them in a way that can get around the First Amendment and due process. I mean, it's a pretty extreme idea, but I mean, again, too, that I think that sensibility of elitism has been retained, and this idea of within the deep state, particularly the foreign policy establishment, that they simply know better, they're more moral, they're more capable of apprehending events around them in a power political capacity that endows them with an innate ability to not really take into consideration the effects of these things as might impact the common man. I believe that's what it is, if that makes any sense.
That makes sense. And I think one of the interesting things I found about him is, some people will say that containment was the hardcore strategy, I guess, compared to what you would term appeasement. But in the 50s and 60s, what was the American right, I guess, at the time? I mean, well, really the Republican Party and some conservative Democrats, they really didn't like the idea of containment because that assumed that the Soviet Union would be around. Like, we were not trying to actively eliminate the Soviet Union and communism. And they preferred the idea of liberationism, that we're going to somehow promote, we're going to liberate the entirety of Eastern Europe and China from communism. And you can see a lot of that rhetoric, going down today, where it's like, we're going to liberate everyone from Iran, the mullahs in Iran. We're going to liberate people from Putin and Assad. Or Xi Jinping, a lot of that rhetoric is there, but that type of anti-communist rhetoric that imagined America as this world crusader against, communism, that was going to, intervene into Hungary and Poland to strip them of communism. There's like some, argument for that. I mean, communism was a terrible system, and clearly it was imposed on the people, not the people chose that. But you could see the moral crusading of neoconservatism in that. And this is a lot of his criticism directed towards Ronald Reagan and other people, and Scoop Jackson has to be, most people don't know this. Scoop Jackson was an Oregon, a senator from Oregon, maybe even Washington. Blanking on that, but he was a typical liberal Democrat, except on foreign policy, and neocons love him. Like, anyone who still references Scoop Jackson today, guaranteed neoconservative, because this guy was very belligerent to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, and he was, this was his main issue. He's complaining about how Soviet Union is oppressing Jews and they need to let them immigrate to here and Israel. And this is what he made his career on. And this is the type of people that really did not like Kennan, because they thought, he was going to allow the Soviet Union to be there. But what do you think of that argument of saying, containment in some ways was a better strategy to pursue versus liberationism, because we now see the rotten fruit of liberationism today, and that is what drove us to a costly, wasteful war in Vietnam.
Well, yeah. Well, it's interesting about communism, and James Burnham used to make this point a lot. And in some ways, much as they agreed, Burnham was kind of a foil to Kennan in a lot of ways. But Burnham made a point about communism that's really resonant. Like, look, like, communism is a very, very unusual ideology. It's really unprecedented, and one of the ways it's unprecedented is, to your point, the way it developed. It wasn't just that cadres were developed that were nakedly undemocratic, and that, when the Bolsheviks prevailed in the Soviet Union early on, communist parties worldwide, they took their cues and said, look, we're not going to trust systems that simply, as long as you do not, agitate against the regime, they don't care what you believe or think. Communism really does insinuate itself in really bizarre ways into people's personal lives, into their inner thoughts, and into their intimate spaces. And Burnham's whole point was that, look, like, the center of this cannot hold, because he's like, what communism is basically doing is it takes a man as, a tabula rasa, and says, well, he's just malleable, and I can simply, shape his values and preferences however I wish. If I'm a party cadre, or an ideological commissar. So Burnham said that, like, this system has a lifespan. But Burnham said, like, on the one hand, yeah, we should zealously resist it, by military means, where it asserts itself against people who are willing to resist it. But on the other hand, Burnham's point was, look, like, if you want to actively roll back communism, he's like, the communists are stockpiling nuclear weapons for a reason. And they will light the earth on fire if you try to destroy them, and they feel as if their, kind of garrison regimes are in fact being slated for destruction. And Kennan did echo that too. I mean, the point, Kennan, he had 2 points in Vietnam. First of all, he's like, look, whatever Vietnam's worth, it's not worth the deaths of tens of thousands of servicemen, nor the homicide of, potentially, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians. Secondly, he said, it's some Kennan this wasn't just his bias against military action. It was actually quite adept. He said, like, the the communists don't know what our intention is. He's like, we deploy there, they might perceive it as like, well, this is the opening salvo and a move to liberate China. And the Soviets might just say, like, well, this is it, let's go all in, now that we have something approaching nuclear parity, because it's better to fight now on our terms than fight on terms of the West. So there was something very, very dangerous about this sensibility of rollback. And interestingly, even though John Kennedy is credited, he created the Special Warfare Centers named after him, and he established, the naval spec war regime. But the Army Green Berets actually came about late in the Korean War because the notion was the people in Truman's regime, who then remained in Eisenhower's in the military establishment. The whole point of special forces was just that, to liberate the captive nations of Central Europe. And that's why the first special forces guys, they were Poles, they were Czechs, they were Armenians, they were guys who could blend in on the ground in the occupied East Bloc as it was viewed. So yeah, there was these were very, very dangerous times. And yeah, one of the things that's insidious about neoconservatism is that it really did it really was able to procure a mandate towards this liberationist ideology once the threat of nuclear annihilation abated. And that people like Kennan we do owe them for probably the fact that a general state of war at the Soviet Union was averted owes to men like Kennan and not just cooler heads who would scale back from the brink when it became clear that the Soviets were in it to win it, as it were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and let's go back to what makes him most famous is the long telegram he sent as, working, I think he was deputy ambassador to Russia, or he was like one of his senior officials in the Russian embassy, and he sent this long telegram warning about the Soviet Union's plans. What was his view of the Soviet Union and its relationship with the Russian past? Because he didn't just see the Soviet Union as this aberration that was just recently invented. He really connected it deep within the Russian past and the Russian people, and he did see this as a continuation of the Russian state. So why don't you explain a little bit what were his views of both Soviet Union and Russia and and their conflict and similarities?
He had a sense of he, like anybody who understands the Russians understands that Russia really is Byzantine, like in metaphorical terms and in actual terms. So Russia looks both east and west, and the Russians have always had a sense that of trying to Russia on the one hand is like the true gateway to the east, through cities like St. Petersburg and like Moscow. So it's uniquely situated to kind of come up first and foremost, like when trends of a political, of a cultural, of a social or technological nature start moving east. Like Russia receives these things first, okay, and like they have something of a gatekeeper function in cultural and political and diplomatic terms. On the other hand, a lot of Russia is incredibly backwards, and a lot of it is incredibly alien. So Russia, there's this great power that somehow is both cosmopolitan and both kind of on the cusp of innovation and development, but also is as backwards as any third world, hellhole. That's very strange. And Kennan made that point, and one of the things he said, Russia gravitated towards Marxism despite the fact that the conditions weren't really right for radicalization, owing to the fact that, outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow, you didn't even have an industrial class of workers. Kennan drew the point that, look, this is Russia's attempt to modernize in part, albeit however misguided it is. If the Russians feel like they're being granted equality of status among great nations, that would probably go a long way towards mitigating their kind of garrison state sensibility. And he I don't think I'm reading too much into this when I say that I think he had something of a sense of what Yaki said, different as like their ideology was. One of the reasons why Kennan called for demobilizing Germany after the war was he said, look, like there's natural interdependence between Germany and Russia. If you want to moderate Russia, if you want it to feel less outside of Europe, if you wanted to view the West as less alien, you've got to cultivate this kind of interdependence with Germany. And he's like, the way to do that is to neutralize Germany by, truly creating a demilitarized, unified state there. And he's like, yeah, okay, the trade-off is that the Soviets are going to be able to insinuate themselves into German political culture, but he's like, on the other hand, like what we gain in terms of global security is going to be invaluable. And that's a very interesting point, I think. And like I said, that was actually a Yaki point, although Yaki had very different reasons for advocating that. as regards Sovietism, and communism generally, yeah. I mean, I he didn't Kennan did not think it was as susceptible a system as Burnham did. And interestingly, in 1958, I think, when the Polish Communist Party began really agitating against central control from Moscow, Kennan made the point that, like, oh wow, this structure in some of the satellite countries seems a lot weaker than I thought. That maybe communism has less of a robust lifespan than I may have predicted in the past. But I think, again, owing to his kind of religiosity, first and foremost, he viewed communism as basically unnatural. So, I mean, he viewed the way to look at the Soviet Union, even if it's a century and a half subsequent to when he was contemplating this, he's like, we got to stop looking at communism like it's just this perennial thing that's just going to exist. He's like, at some point, it's not going to exist. And the Russian people will still be there, and they're going to have a long memory, as has been demonstrated by their historical consciousness. They're going to remember how we treated them, when they were like enthralled to the system. We've got to think carefully about the legacy we create. I mean, that's kind of the way I read it.
Yeah, no, and I think he probably did change a lot of his views as time went on. I mean, as any person who's involved in policy and for, I don't know, man, like 60 or 70 years, as I mean, he died in 2005 at 101.
Yeah,
he entered the foreign service in the late 20s. So this is somebody who saw a lot, nearly 80 years of experience in commenting on the state of foreign affairs. And, that does have an effect on it. But one group of people that really, really likes George Kennan is the American Conservative. Whenever I remember there was like a magazine article, there was like their cover. It was like 4 or 5 years. It might even been longer. It was like what we want for real conservatism. And on top, they have like the bad conservatism. And it's like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and maybe even like Ted Cruz or something. And then they have like the good conservatism. And it's like Flannery O'Connor and George Kennan, and I think maybe Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke. And that's like the good conservatism. And so why do you think that paleoconservatives really, really like Kennan? I mean, yeah, you could say it's something with realism, but it seems that he connects on a much deeper level than sharing similar foreign policy ideas.
I mean, I think it's his religious orientation. And interestingly, Russell Kirk, even though, I mean, Russell Kirk became this like huge Catholic, and he's another like paleocon kind of avatar. But Russell Kirk, I believe he was a Catholic convert, and that comes out in like the consciousness of a conservative. Like, he writes a lot like a dissenter Protestant. And I think the paleocon movement, I believe, despite the fact there's all these trad cats who are into it, like the brass tacks of it really are kind of Calvinist and deterministic and very much about the inner witness and like, well, the kind of congregational community being the first community, and ideology, rather than like adopting an ideology to try and structure man's affairs in lieu of just kind of relying on reason, to discern like God's will as to what he would have for man. I mean, I think that this idea that the natural order precedes man, but in very, very nakedly moral terms, not just like Aristotelian terms. I think that's a big part of it. And also, I think, paleocons tend to look at people like me. I mean, they tend to look at paleocons like to distinguish themselves from people like me. Okay, I'll be honest. Okay, and that doesn't bother me.
What kind of person are you, Thomas? You're a highly respected guest. I don't know what's wrong with you.
I think I'm pretty dope, but
we will not let you be looked down upon on this show. I will say that.
No, I really appreciate that. But I think part of it is that, guys like Russell Kirk, guys like George Kennan, they were guys who they took very seriously, differences between the sexes. They were very conscious of race and ethnicity and things, but they were conscious of these things in a very moralistic way, not like a way that could be interpreted as like fascistoid or like racialist or anything like that. So I think that's kind of the alibi of the paleocon in part. I mean, I'm sure I'm not trying to make people mad by saying that. I'm sure those paleocons listening right now who are very dope guys, and I'm not trying to say bad things about them. But in terms of the people who really kind of make public opinion, in terms of that audience, guys like Pat Buchanan was about a decade or two ago, maybe guys like John Mearsheimer. I mean, although I realize it's primarily a foreign policy guy, but I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, I think it's very much. I think it's very much theological, and I think it's very much about an alibi to distinguish oneself from what's perceived as, fascist kind of ideas. I've thought about this a lot, and I really do believe that.
I would agree with that, and I think we need to, distinguish what paleocons, because paleocon has like become back into the fore as a popular term. There's a lot of people who, got into this stuff through Trump, or the Trump moment. A lot of people are like, "Well, I'm an America First nationalist. I'm like Pat Buchanan. I'm a paleocon." Pat Buchanan calls himself a paleocon, and there are many different levels or differences in like types of paleocons. There is like Pat Buchanan who gets race and immigration. And then there are like paleocons like Rod Dreher, whose permanent position is being like a groundhog. Like the groundhog strategy is everything is running away from anything too controversial, and then realizing that everything is gone, and they're just going to burrow underground, and hopefully the iron boot of totalitarianism doesn't crush them because they've buried underground, and they're having their little Benedict option. So they have their little niche Orthodox church down in the hole, and they think that's how they'll build society up. And they flee from any accusations of race or anything that, as you would say, that may strike them of a fascist or racialist. So they do bury their heads into that. And Kennan kind of had that. I mean, even Kennan was like an elite person. Like, this is somebody who went to Princeton. This is somebody who spent his whole life in the State Department, with mixing with fellow elites. This is somebody who talked with fellow foreign policy people. He knew what would make him sound like a crank. And, going all in on caring about like, the South's plight with segregation, that would make him a crank. And he would have never done that because of D-class. And it was the same with, I think in a lot of ways, he maintained his position. He got a lot of the stuff, but ultimately he still was a part of the elite class in general, which is like good that that people, it does show a difference between the elite, the American elite between now and Kennan's time. Like, somebody like Kennan who held those views, they wouldn't survive in the State Department. They wouldn't survive, and certainly no Secretary of State would have been calling them up if they knew what they thought about South Africa. And even in this Gaddis book, Gaddis makes a point. Is like, he, in a very fair way, he's like, Kennan understood that race informed culture, and was like, and it really was a important principle to his people. He doesn't write in a condemnatory way. I just messed up that word, but it's okay. In a very negative way. He was just saying this is his viewpoint. And, I don't think anyone in the modern, deep state understands that. Nobody in the CIA or anybody like that. Yeah. And I think with like paleocons, like, I think I would agree with your point. And I think, with the paleocons who are listening to the show, they call themselves paleocon because they're like, I agree with everything Pat Buchanan stood for, and he calls himself a paleocon. And that's the type of paleocon there is. And, they would like Kennan as well, but if they read more about him. But the particular paleocons I'm talking about are like the people who write at American Conservative, who are, they spend their whole life like trying to find niche and ways of saying like, I'm a right-wing reactionary without fear of being called a racist, and that's their primary goal. And I think, those people really do like him, because in the end, like Kennan, even though he was a winner in life, I mean, well, I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but this is somebody who's like very successful, but ultimately his diary revealed somebody who is like very dour and everything is lost. But, I'm still experiencing this great life, and a lot of paleocons are like that as well. And anything that would particularly risk that life, they're not going to, engage in. They're not going to talk about race and ethnicity and identity issues. They're just going to stick to talking about church issues, and maybe they'll like say some things about gender that they're not allowed to say in a mainstream publication, but they know that's still much better territory to tread on than anything dealing with race. And so they can keep the normal life, but at the end of the day they realize they're going to lose, and they're fine with being a loser. And it creates a certain type of mentality and psyche that they do share with Kennan. And I think even with some other writers, like they're like upholding Flannery O'Connor, who wrote these like very depressing, dark books. And it's like, I don't think this is like a very positive message, like of like inspiring people. And it's never about inspiring. It's like, well, the most we can hope for is to dig a hole, bury ourselves in it, and hope that no one interrupts us sitting in our hole.
No, big time. and it's like one of the things, like Kennan went to Scandinavia a lot. I think he was just attracted to the culture there, and like in the 70s, there's like an anecdote where in the 70s he was like this guy who was like kind of like his guide in Denmark, and there was some sort of like peace festival going on, and Kennan dropped on him something like, you know, all these kids, you know, these half naked girls and these people smoking pot and drinking, you know, he's like, they, you know, a well disciplined platoon of Russians could wipe out this whole country. You know, it's like, okay, on the one hand, I feel that, particularly in the 70s when like a lot of degenerate shit was going on, but it's like, you know, on the other hand, like some of these Paleogon types, it's almost like they're constitutionally opposed to like people having fun, you know, and it's like there is
Yeah.
like one of the reasons why the left are assholes is because like they get mad about like people having fun, and like we don't want to be like them, you know. It's like, and look, man, it's like I go to church, I'm a Christian, man, you know, and like I even though I fail a lot, you know, I try to avoid sin, but it's like at the same time too, you know, it's like man is one half savage, and it's like, you know, we don't need more people like railing against, you know, like immorality if we're just talking about guys like smoking weed, drinking beers, and like, you know, chasing skirt. I mean, that's frankly this is like these are frankly like very vital impulses, and yeah,
Our basic human emotion, instincts.
and I
It's
think
like, it's like imagining the good old days. No one ever chased skirt back in the good old days. Like, there's this mentality like pre like 1965, like their sex outside of marriage had never been invented.
Oh no, of course not.
And that no one abused drugs or substance abuse or, you know, anything like that. Everything was pitch perfect. It was like Leave It to Beaver for all of history. And it's like, no. And that's not quite it. I mean, you do need to control these impulses. And that's what, you know, a lot of what Christianity tries to do is it tries to contain and restrain these natural human impulses so that we can have a functioning civilization. At the same time, like people are going to engage in this stuff, and it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Like people were like, I mean, soldiers in World War II, like both sides would be engaged in debauchery after the battlefield, and so had soldiers until since the beginning of time have done that. So it's, you know, it's a natural human impulse. You just have to, you know, temper it and restrain it in order to have a successful society. And yeah, I do. They do really have this like anti-fun mentality. It's like these same old, they like really like being curmudgeons too. And it's like, we need to ban video games. And it's like, and then like, this is a very popular idea, not even just among paleoconservatives, but mainstream conservatives in general, particularly among like boomers and Gen Xers. Is like, they think we need to ban video games, and somehow that will lead to high, like, a baby boom, and we'll have like higher marriage rates. But I mean, there's like a lot of other social factors that are causing that, and video games are more like alleviating alienation rather than causing alienation. And I think a lot of them mistake you know, symptoms for causes. And I think that does come out with a lot of their curmudgeonly attitudes towards people having fun.
Well, no, indeed, and it's also too. It's like, look, like the reason why I advocate against stuff like porn or like interracial propaganda, like in media, you know, it's not because like I'm telling people, go, hey, you know, it's not because I'm trying to sound like some fucking preacher or something, or like some fire and brimstone pastor. It's because these things are nakedly political. You know, they're nakedly political attacks by a hostile culture upon us who, you know, are people they view as their enemies. You know, frankly, in politics, you really should not be moralizing. You know, I mean, like, it's not really the place for that. You're going to alienate more people than you corral. And also, it's like, you know, like politics is its own sphere, man, and it's of human action. You know, it's not synonymous with personal morality, and it's not some teaching tool by which we like make man better. And like, I think, yeah, I mean, the paleocons get way too much. I mean, obviously, like the guiding pole star, if you're a white Westerner, has got to be, you know, scripture as well as, you know, the classical tradition. But that, yeah, they get way too hung up on this role of, you know, kind of morally outraged curmudgeon. And I mean, that's bullshit, but it's just fucking tiresome, man. You know, it's like I tune out immediately when people start dropping that kind of shit on me. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Me as well. So veering back to the Cold War, you wrote a recent piece for your Substack calling for revisionism of how we view the Cold War itself. Why don't you explain that, and why you think we need this revisionism? What revisionism would look like, and, you know, the details of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two things going on here. I mean, the one thing, first and foremost, even though it's fading somewhat for, you know, younger people, World War II still remains kind of like the focus of the 20th century. I mean, which is totally understandable. But even in terms of critical revisionism, even guys who take a very critical view of Nuremberg, of the narrative of the Second World War, its causes, and some of the excesses therein, and assigning war guilt, they really just kind of accept at face value, like the Cold War. They're like, okay, the communists, they were these radical left wingers, and they were on a mission of conquest, to kind of create a world system in their image. So it was great that they were stopped, but then subsequently, we had all these social problems in America that just kind of ensued, and from like the Clinton administration onward. Like, that's the wrong way to look at it. I understand why people view it that way, because it's like, why would they know otherwise? You kind of have to deep dive into some esoteric topics to really get a handle on it. But really, one of the reasons why the concord between the United States and the Soviet Union fell apart around the time of the Berlin airlift is because the Soviets really were kind of a reactionary society. And like, that was Yaki's point. It's like, look, like, the Soviet system's terrible. It oppresses people. It imprisons dissidents and is brutalizing. But he's like, that's, they're not socially engineering things the way it's happening in the occupied western sector of Germany. It's like pornography is illegal in the Soviet Union. Homosexuality is an actual crime. The Soviets did deploy women in frontline roles in the war, but that's because they had to, because they took horrific casualties. They were actually very much committed to a kind of traditional paradigm between the sexes. The identity of Russians as kind of the first nationality in the Soviet Empire was very much a point that was driven home from Stalin until Brezhnev and Andropov. So and Gottfried wrote a great book on this. Like, one of the big major clefts between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't that the Soviets were so radical. It's that the Soviets were in some ways kind of reactionary, like comparatively. It was the United States that was dropping, pornography on West Germany as pursuant to, the kind of Adorno's notion of, well, this is how you break people of their authoritarian tendencies. It's by, encouraging them towards eros. There was no denazification program in East Germany. Like, if the Soviets believed you were involved in, quote, war crimes, yeah, they hanged a lot of former National Socialists, but they didn't educate people on the Holocaust. They didn't they didn't classify people according to their purported tendencies to sympathize with fascism. Like, they didn't care about that at all. In fact, a lot of the guys in the early East German army were like former Wehrmacht officers. It's like they weren't heavily vetted or anything. And so this idea that like the Soviet Union was this like radicalizing influence in the world, like, it really wasn't. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, in order to wage the Cold War, America really had to engage in a dialectical way with the Third World, basically that caused a certain scrutiny to be applied to American society that would not have otherwise. Okay, and that was really the impetus for desegregation. America was going to Latin America, it was going to the Middle East, it was sending its emissaries to Africa, to Southeast Asia, and saying, like, look, like, this is why you need to participate in our system and model yourselves in our image and resist communism. But of course, the rebuttal of that is, but like, why? Like, you guys don't respect colored people. You have segregation. Whites are on top of the proverbial heap, and in your culture, why should we abide this? So America had to demonstrate that it was committed to this kind of racial equity and these kinds of, and it kind of had to appeal to like a socialistic sensibility in order to basically sway global opinion in favor of the West and the Cold War. So, I mean, in any dialectical process, in arguing against your enemy vociferously, you take on his characteristics. I mean, that's, kind of dumbed down Hegelianism, right? I mean, so there's that. So, I mean, aside from the fact that the whole reason why the Soviet Union became so ascendant is that America destroyed the Third Reich, which was the hedge against communism and the Soviet Union, the issue is frankly that by waging the Cold War, like, America became forced to neutralize what the Soviets had going for them in terms of persuasion by adopting a lot of, the purported equitable features of socialism, like racial equality, like women's liberation, like things of this sort. At the end of the day, so it begs the question, like, what did this actually get us? If you're like a man of the right, like, why was this a good thing? So, I mean, basically, I'm trying to encourage people, especially younger guys, who are a lot of my readers, and I'm thankful for that, to kind of look at the Cold War with a critical eye and not through this kind of simple paradigm of like right and left, and oh, the communists were the bad guys, we were fighting for the right or something. That's really what I meant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I still would say that the Soviet Union and communism were, I don't know if necessarily if I would say radicalizing force. I mean, they were, they were rising up, supporting a lot of these third world anti-Western colonial revolts. Some of that, in a way, they were going to win anyway, but they were promoting this. Early, if in terms of foreign policy, they were promoting an anti-Western. I don't know if you would call that anti-white, like we're experiencing today, but that was what they're promoting. But I think the most negative effect, I mean, I agree with a lot of your points, but it did force America to see of itself as an idea, because, you know, Soviet Union was promoting itself as an idea. The idea of the Soviet Union is communism. So the idea of America is liberalism. And we have to promote that to the world. And it's like a competing, it's like two competing brands for the rest of the world. And instead of America turning itself into a real place with the real people with, you know, that are native to it, that define it, instead what defines America is our ideas, the free market and the Constitution. And these ideas need to spread to every single part of the world and to oppose communism. And this really accelerated during the Cold War, even though we had this messianic ideas, even from the revolution on. People are just like, well, we'll just stand as an example. We're not going to really promote it. And most people agreed that like the rest of the world can't be America. Only American can be in America. And I think even someone like Thomas Jefferson, who, you know, in some of his more airy moments would say stuff like this. You know, he wasn't, you know, demanding that America, you know, liberate, you know, Africa from the, or whatever, you know, to spread democracy to them. But I think this idea of America as the world's police force, as we have to spread democracy to every part of the globe, you know, even though the roots of that were seen in, you know, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. The 14 points, like I said, we want nations of national self-determination, which in some ways that's something we support, but the globalist order is very much opposed to that. So, but yes, the Cold War really accelerated it. And once the Cold War ended, you know, we then were like, well, what do we do now? And now we've been like trying to take out any part of the globe that resists us, from Serbia to Iraq to Syria. And, you know, we're actively promoting evil to the world through the deep state and the State Department and a lot of this infrastructure that Kennan, you know, helped develop. I mean, even though it's operating in a way that he would certainly not support if he were still alive today. But that is something, you know, that was developed during the Cold War, and we still have this mindset that's been created by it. So yes, I think we technically won, but it came at the cost of turning ourselves into this gross absurdity of a nation that just exists itself as an idea that must spread itself all over the world like a contagion. And now that's what we have to resist and fight back against and challenge. And I think Donald Trump was the first, you know, whatever his faults, was the first person to challenge this consensus, and, you know, a haphazard, goofy way that he did. But he was the first president who wouldn't be like, we have to spread freedom everywhere. You know, Ronald Reagan would say that, but he wasn't saying that. He's like, you know, and his thing about talking about Iraq is like, if we went in, we should have taken the oil for our people. You know, that is something that's much better than like spreading democracy, even though I don't think we should have gone into Iraq and stolen their oil. I think that's much more admirable trait than the stated reasons we used.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I agree.
So that's something. But yeah, I think that's very important to revise something about the Cold War. And I think that's one important point. And another to consider is that the reason why we desegregated and we essentially forced the South to undergo a second Reconstruction was due to the Cold War and in our marketing campaign to the Third World, is that we forced the South to utterly change itself, and we destroyed our cities just so we could market ourselves better to Ghana and Cambodia. So was that worth it? I don't think so. But, you know, if they had followed more George Kennan's moderate realist approach, maybe we wouldn't have had those problems. So to conclude on the Kennan Cold War discussion, what lessons do you think Kennan holds for us today?
I mean, I think really, I mean, kind of the tragedy of Kennan is that, you know, the U.S., I do not have warm feelings or charitable views about America in the 20th century. However, I will say that like I said, pre 93 or so, the State Department did really attract some incredibly talented people. You know what I mean? Kennan was he was a very serious theorist of international relations, and he had an innate understanding of power political questions. And it you really need that kind of countervailing tendency in a place like America, where the military establishment is such a strong lobby. And make no mistake, it really is a powerful lobby. I mean, that should go without saying. But optically, it's a bit more hidden than it was, during the Cold War. But owing to the peculiar structure of America, you really do need people in the diplomatic corps who are based and who are sensible and who are not simply careerists and who are not merely mouthpieces of the deep state and its discrete interests. I mean, I think that's the lesson of Kennan. And also, I mean, to your point just now, like I don't demand people accept my view of the Cold War in the 20th century. However, like what ensued was unconscionably bad. I mean, so yeah, Kennan's validated every day because the kind of active rollback, like the way containment was hijacked in terms of this liberationist sensibility and this interventionist tendency. I mean, yeah, it's Kennan's proven right every day just by virtue of the fact that America came apart at the seams as a proximate result of pursuing this aggressive strategy against the Soviets, and believe it all goes back to that. That's not conjecture. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it more than anything.
I think those are some pretty good lessons, but we're now going to switch off to a completely different topic due to the Patreon questions, which I would really like to get your take on this question, because I think you're going to have some good ideas or some fire views about these subjects that are brought up by this question. So as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or a guest questions if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respect This Patreon. This one comes from Dave. He said, Scott, do you really believe fraternities are better than unions? And this, of course, comes from a tweet where I said, fraternities greater than unions. And I 100% stand by that, even though this is I think a lot of people aren't going to like this take. Fraternities in general, I mean, not like the traditional ones in like the South and Midwest, they are right-wing breeding grounds. Like that's where, if you're like a conservative or normal white person on college campus who likes to work out, typically holds views that are somewhat similar to ours in a basic manner, and you want to find like-minded people, you're going to join a fraternity. A union at the same time, like everyone wants to keep, as I said last week's episode, unions aren't necessarily the hardened steel workers of old. They're usually fat, non-white school teachers. The vast majority of unions are public sector, and even like the good one, and even if there are some good ones that are like traditional working class, their money is being used to go towards left-wing causes in the Democratic Party, and that's what is being advocated for. So most of their efforts is helping to hurt America, while like fraternities are one of the few institutions in America that, not necessarily the national chapters, and also note, I'm not saying sororities, because sororities generally force their chapters to be more diverse and like accept diversity and like accept like transgender members and such. Fraternities have on a chapter level are not doing that. These are one of the few institutions we have that are right leaning. We just have like mega church evangelicals, police unions, and fraternities. I'm sure there may be a few other institutions, but this is like basically it. And just for that fact, I would say they're better. There is a lot of problems with fraternities, which we'll probably bring up with Thomas, because Thomas did talk about fraternities in his book of posts. I don't know if that's still available, but I read it, and you did have some posts about fraternities that are pretty funny. So I would like to turn over to Thomas. What do you think of fraternities and unions?
I mean, fraternities, see, it's like this. Like I went to a big city university. Like I went to Loyola Chicago. So, and I mean, like if you go to an urban college, like fraternities like aren't a thing. I mean, I think they're a mixed bag in like the Big Ten and in kind of state U's. I mean, some are based, like some are fucking just really kind of degenerate and awful. But I think Yeah, I agree with you generally, and I think fraternities became this kind of people like to burn them in effigy because they associate them with like Chad guys, like being mean to females or God knows what else.
Which is based like this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
what
I mean,
we want.
it's like
It's
the
like all
fever
the
dream.
things like I had a bunch of my followers. Like I asked, like, were you in a fraternity? I was in a fraternity, of course. And there's these followers like, no, I'm not gay or I'm not homosexual. And then they had all these things about like, no, because I didn't want to get sodomized and hazing. I'm like, that is not hazing. And these guys are just like admitting that they're like, afraid of getting like having to go through an initiation process in order to be accepted by men. And like every male group that is good has had some type of hazing since the beginning of time. Like it doesn't even like like our military hazes you in boot camp. And that's what makes you like a part of the force. I mean, regardless of your thoughts about the military, but that's how it is for every male group. That's how you bond. And generally, like some hazing can be really stupid, but I don't think most of these people imagine that they're like getting sexually assaulted by their fraternity members. Like that's not really happening. I mean, mainly what it's doing is like they're making you do calisthenics and learn stuff, and like they're yelling at you to clean the house, and then and make it. And sometimes the real problem comes with a lot of the deaths is that they're like make them drink too much. But that's a different story. I mean, I don't think it's a lot of these people. They don't want to subject themselves into an order and like submit to a hierarchy where they have to earn their place. And yeah, a lot of hazing can be stupid, but in the general concept of it, every male group that's worth its salt has some degree of that.
Yeah, and I think like I said, I think it's weird for guys who purport to be on the right. I mean, yeah, like I said, I mean, I was a city guy. I wasn't part of a fraternity, but I never had like a hard as fuck view against them because frankly, it's like that's people burn them in effigy because, like I said, it's like in the fever dreams of liberals. It's like, oh, these guys sit around plotting to like rape women, and they sit around like figuring out ways to like be mean to black people or something. It's like it's something like fucking squares and like Karens like project their anxieties on you, and yeah, that's bullshit. I'm sure I'm sure fraternities do a lot of positive shit. I mean, particularly, I mean, socially, I mean, like, and yeah, I mean, even if they didn't, it's like what other fucking what other kind of social group, if you're a regular white dude, can you like freaking attach to like at a big state university? But about unions, I made the point before, I'm pro union in national economies where they have a place. Like in America, when America truly had a manufacturing economy, and when technology was advanced enough, think like mid-century until like the 70s, that was kind of like the zenith of unions until about 73. Because like if you have, 30,000 people working at the GM plant, and it's basically, 10,000 guys all doing the same job, it's like, well, that union has power because they can literally shut down manufacturing. So that gives them bargaining power against management. And when the national economy depends upon the export of these manufacturers, it's like, well, that's kind of like the give and take of, labor and management. Like saying that like public school teachers or like Starbucks baristas need a quote union. I mean, it's like, okay, it's like that doesn't really make sense. It's like that's not really going to confer upon them, any kind of bargaining power, but it's also not really bargaining power they need, man. It's like, it's the whole point. Half the issue with unions is safety. Like the other half of the equation is that, well, a company like GM or a company like US Steel, it's like those manufacturers really were the backbone of the national economy. Like the guys doing those jobs, they are entitled to a piece of the revenue that's being derived. And if wages are not increasing with profitability, I mean, that's a problem. And it's like management's not going to pay you what you're owed unless you can threaten them with literally sabotaging profits. I mean, that's where unions fit in. Like they don't fit in as like, like the girl working at Forever 21 needs a union. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, there's labor problems there too. And like those chicks working there, I'm sure they are getting kind of screwed on what they're being compensated. But like a union is not the solution to that. And yeah, so unions as they exist today, they're not unions at all. And other than a name, and they're basically just like another layer of management with a handful of exceptions. I mean, that's my view in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of good points, but and I also want to add like another thing with the union. A lot of some of the people on the right are like saying the solution to unions is to get them to de-recognize their public sector side, or like the sides of that are not traditionally are not associated with traditional blue collar fields. And it's like that's like the solution to telling Google, it's like, hey, you need to de-recognize your search engine and just focus on Android. And that's like, we need you to focus. We need to eliminate your main moneymaker and just focus on this one part of your company. And I think you're going to go along with this. Like, why would unions do this? They make all their money from the public sector side. They would eliminate like 2/3 of their members and like 2/3 of their money. You know, it's like, it's never going to happen. I think, you know, the real solution, unfortunately, I mean, I agree unions have a place in society and especially with negotiating. But I think the way that we operate in America is not necessarily the best way. I mean, people will want to cite like strong unions in Scandinavia and Germany. Well, they operate in a much different manner. And a lot of times they're part of the company itself. And they're there at the management board. You know, they bring in the union, and there's not necessarily this conflict between management and union workers that we that's built in America. I mean, and a lot of German workers and Scandinavian workers seem pretty happy with how their unions operate. And people will cite that and say like, well, we need that here. But, you know, they have a completely different system. And, you know, there's also a lot of differences between Norway and America.
Yeah,
like,
you
know, demographics and stuff, and who they're representing. So, you know, the best way to help reform unions in America is to support a lot of these things that are busting them up. So if you bust them up, and then they'll reform. And I think you really need to pass stuff that like crushes public sector unions. And then like we could have like a decent like union system, but it doesn't come from trying to curry favor with unions as they exist now. Like you can appeal to the workers, like the traditional blue collar workers that are in these fields through like promoting immigration restriction, trade protection, and like, you know, making sure their companies are paying them a fair share. But you're going to have to go over the union's head. And the best way to ensure that unions reform is to, you know, like do policies that not necessarily they want because their leadership is so bad. And then once you downsize unions, maybe you could build up something that, you know, stands against corporations. But when it comes to our issues, as I've like argued in my Revolver piece and on the podcast last week and many times before, you know, they're not an impediment to woke capitalists. On the issues that we deeply care about, on culture and identity issues, they're on the same page with these woke CEOs. So we can't count on them to resist it, even though some of the guys who are like pipe fitters or steel workers who are in a union, a lot of those guys are supportive of our ideas, but though they are the minority in the organized labor movement. So those are my final thoughts. Thomas, any further thoughts on unities unities, unions or fraternities?
No, man, I think that about covers it. And yeah, I agree very much with that take.
All right. Well, thank you, Thomas. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thomas, as we said at the beginning of the show, got kicked off Twitter, so you better follow him on his other platforms. So, Thomas, tell the good people how to follow your work.
Sure. Check me out at Gab. It's at real_Thomas777, just like it was on Twitter. I got the same handle on Post, POAST. That's a platform that's blowing up a little bit, but it's not quite where Gab is at yet. It's the same handle, at real_Thomas777. You can also hit me up on Telegram. I've been dropping a lot of stuff on Telegram, and we've already got over 1,000 followers. And a lot of the guys and girls on there have been dropping some really great stuff. I mean, it's not just me. You know, there's a lot of shit on there you will want to check out because it's very much like a crowdsourced kind of thing. So yeah, check us out at Telegram.
Don't you have a Substack too?
Yeah, Substack is realthomas777.substack.com. No underscore anything, just realthomas777.substack.com. And yeah, our Telegram is t.me/realthomas777. So yeah, you can find me any of those places. And yeah, like I said, particularly Telegram, I behoove you to check it out because there's a lot of content being dropped on there every day.
All right. Well, I highly recommend all highly respected listeners to give him a follow on the platform of your choice. Thomas, we definitely miss you on Twitter, so hopefully you come back. I don't know if under a secret name or you come back as Thomas77, but maybe you could sneak back on. Maybe Twitter will forget about you in a month or two.
Yeah, I'll consider it moving forward. Yeah, I'll consider it moving forward. I got some print deadlines I got to meet, but yeah, this summer I may make a triumphant return.
Yeah, print deadlines. Do you have your book coming out?
Yeah, I've got a book. I want to let my I mean, we're still moving forward to the Nuremberg project, looking for a summer release for that. But in the interim, I'm dropping something, but I want to wait for my publisher to do that because it's on. I mean, it's in his hands now, so I don't want to announce that yet. But it'll be in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, well, we'll be on the lookout for it. Of course, Thomas will rejoin us again soon enough. So, Thomas, thanks for coming on again.
No, thank you, my guy. I really appreciate you.
Hey, we love having Thomas on the show. But until next time, stay respected.